Hello. The reason this video is made because I struggle to find a decent and comprehensive review and buyer's guide on the Vulcan 800 model, and I try to fill that gap. Of course, you can find all sorts of videos showing off different exhausts, different so-called builds, and all other stuff, but nothing that informs you about this bike in depth, what to expect, what it's like in comparison to other similar motorcycles. So I try and give you a bit more information about that. So let's start with the beginning. What this bike is, well, they were made in three different configurations, shall we say. There was the Vulcan 800A model that was made between 1995 and 2003. There was the Vulcan 800B, or also called as the Vulcan 800 Classic, that was made between 96 and 2006. There was also the Vulcan 800 Drifter, which had two different versions depending on the year of manufacture. And it had the VN 800C that was made in the early years in 99 and 2000. And there was the Vulcan 800E Drifter, which was made between 2001 and 2006. Now, the difference between the two Drifter models is just cosmetic, essentially, because the 800C models had sandblasted matte engine covers and valve covers. The E model had chrome-plated stuff, just like the Classic or the A model. So they just pepped up the looks, really. So that's all. These bikes are usually called Harley copies. Actually, they are very good Harley copies when it comes to styling. The 800A model that tries to resemble, and it's a cheeky copy of the Softail standard, the Harley Softail standard. The 800B is quite similar to a Heritage Classic, Softail Heritage Classic, or the exception is the Drifter series, which tries to resemble a 1950s Indian Chief with its big fenders and whatnot. Now, the predecessor of this model is the Vulcan 750, which was a typical 1980s Japanese cruiser. It had full instrumentation, 2 gauges on top of the handlebars. It was a very high revving engine. Essentially, it was a sports tourer engine in a Japanese cruiser frame, with lots of high tech, like hydraulic valve adjustments. So it had hydraulic tappets. But it has very typical Japanese looks. So it was more like the Viragos of that era. It's a 1980s design. Japanese did not really figure out the aesthetic part of this styling yet. Now, let's start with the basics. I don't want to bore you with all the specifications. I just want to hit the high points. They push about 55 horsepower and 65 newton meters, which is 48 pound-feet of torque, and that's measured on the crankshaft. They all have low seat height, about 70 centimeters, which is 28 inches, and they carry 15 liters of fuel, which is 4 US gallons, and the last 20% of the tank is reserve. There is no fuel pump. It's gravity fed. It is a very simple system. Now, as far as dimensions are concerned, they are pretty much as big as full-size Harley Davidsons of the day. Length and width-wise, it's bloody hell, it's just very close. They are all 2.4 meters in length, which is 95 inches. But they are fairly light in comparison, because the Vulcan 800 models weigh around 520 pounds or 235 kilos. So they are much lighter than the Harleys. As far as the comfort is concerned, well, they fit most people. The pegs are forward enough for tall people, but they are close enough for short riders to get a decent purchase on them. The seat is fairly subjective, to be honest, but it's one of the better ones I've tried. Let's talk about the technical side of things for a little bit. Basically, it is a Vulcan 750 engine, but it is updated and simplified. The Vulcan 750 had double overhead cams and all sorts of different tech that made it quite complicated and difficult to work on. It has been simplified significantly. It is very easy to work on these bikes. These have single camshafts driven by a chain. They all have 4 valves per cylinder, 2 intake and 2 exhaust, of course. They are air and liquid cooled. Those fins on the side of the cylinders are essentially the oil coolers. So they have a function. It's not just cosmetic sort of thing. They have a single crank pin on the crankshaft, which gives it the traditional engine note, like Harley Davidson's, and they're also similar to the Yamaha Viragos, V-Stars, or the Shadow 600. They are all single crank pin engines, which means the 2 connecting rods and the 2 pistons act on the very same crank pin, so the firing intervals are very similar to the original Harley Davidson sort of firing interval. Unlike, for example, the Suzuki Intruder series, which have offset crank pins, and they sound more like Ducatis or Yamaha MT-07s, or the early 1980s Honda Shadow 700s, 750s, or the 1100 series, which also had offset crank pins, and they sound more like inline twins. So as far as the engine note or the exhaust note is concerned, they're closer to the American ideal, of course. Right, they are fairly over square. They have a big bore and short stroke, so they are quite rev happy. In that regard, they inherited some of the good traits of the Vulcan 750. But they also have 50% more flywheel mass than the Vulcan 700s, so the usable torque starts around 2000 RPM, so you don't have to rev the engine up to get usable torque from it. So it has a really nice and flexible engine. It is also very smooth because the engine has balancer shaft right next to the crankshaft, and it also has rubber mounts on the engine, on the front section of it. More on that later. So yeah, it is very smooth with very little amount of vibrations. It also has just the one carburetor. It's a single carb system. It sits between the 2 cylinders on the right side of the bike. It's a 36mm Kihin CVK. It is nearly identical to the Harley Davidson carburetors of the day. It has a chain drive, or the Vulcan 800s are chain driven. So actually the chain needs some attention, or a chain holder kit. However, this comes with an advantage too, but more on that a little bit later. As far as the ride is concerned, due to its low weight, it is a fairly quick bike in its class. The 0 to 60 time, or 0 to 100 kilometers per hour time is about 6 seconds. If you ride it solo, it is a very peppy bike that can keep up with much bigger ones with no problems whatsoever. Obviously up to a point, and that's where the limitations of the 800cc engine kicks in. Around town and back roads up to about 120 kilometers per hour or 75 miles per hour, this thing moves really well. Overtaking is not a problem. The engine has a very wide power band from 2000 to 6000 RPM. Sorry, the torque curve is very, very flat, and the horsepower just climbs nicely up, proportional with the revs. So essentially, if you need to overtake anyone, you just click it down to the fourth gear, and away you go. Beyond that, beyond 120 kilometers or 75 miles per hour, of course, things slow down a bit. Between 120 and 140 or 75 and 85 miles, it is still reasonable as far as acceleration is concerned, but above 140, which is around 85 miles per hour, it loses its momentum and the needle climbs even slower on the speedometer. And around 165 kilometers per hour, which is around 100 miles, 105 miles, it just hits a wall. It just can't go any faster. For normal usage, this is more than adequate. Obviously, if you want to go full gung-ho, 800cc is not your league anyway. Keep in mind that larger bikes are usually not proportionally more powerful. Having twice the displacement comes with twice the torque. That is true, but also a lot more weight. So with most big displacement cruisers, well, they have very similar 0 to 60 and quarter-mile times. And up to normal legal speeds, they don't have too many advantages. The big displacement bikes have the edge over 75 miles per hour or 120 kph, or riding uphill or riding with heavy loads, because torque carries the weight and climbs hills. But horsepower numbers being similar, these bikes can keep up nicely if ridden at reasonable speeds, of course. Of course, there are exceptions. Among the big bikes, there are the muscle cruisers, which are specifically designed to shred the asphalt. I'm talking about the M109 Suzuki, which is also known as the VZR 1800 in Europe. So yeah, muscle cruisers are exception. I'm talking about like-for-like comparison, like the Vulcan 800 compared to a 1500cc Intruder or a 1500cc Vulcan, or something along those lines, or Honda Shadow 1100, that sort of thing. So not muscle cruisers. Now, let's talk about the suspension and brakes. They are relatively stable at speed. The 16-inch wide front wheel gives the bike a nice and planted feel, up to about 80 miles per hour, which is about 130 kph. The A models, with their skinny front tires, because those have 21-inch skinny front tires, are a little bit less planted, but they are still very nice on the twisties at a moderate pace. Less surface obviously comes with less grip, so yeah. On the flip side, they are very nimble around town, and they look nice. Also, they can go a bit faster due to less rolling resistance, but high-speed cornering is not their forte. So 800 Classics and Drifters are a little bit better at that. The front suspension is fairly soft. Progressive springs are highly recommended. The original prescribed fork oil is 10 weight. But for some people, heavier people, 12.5 or 15 weight might be a better choice. Classic and Drifter models have shrouded forks. The fork seals last a long time, as there are no rock chips to impact on the stanchions and make them rough or damage them. Obviously much less road grime to get in there to eat up the rubber sealing lips, so in that regard they are a bit better than A models. The rear suspension, however, is a bit different. It is difficult to adjust to begin with, because you have to take a few parts off the bike. It is hidden inside the frame, under the seat. So yeah, it is difficult to adjust. It is also difficult to dial in properly. It has 7 stages or 7 settings, and the first 2 are quite soft, and on that setting it bottoms out even on smaller bumps if you weigh over, let's say, 85-90 kilos, which is about 200 pounds. 5, 6 and 7 are quite stiff. They are for heavy people or 2-up riding. It is very, very, very harsh for solo rides. Of course, there are aftermarket options made by B-Tubo or YSS, Hagon and Progressive. So if you'd like to upgrade the suspension, there are aftermarket options. Now, the front brake on the A model is just a single piston caliper. It is not superb, but it can be improved with sintered brake pads and braided brake hoses. Classic and Drifter models come with twin piston calipers. They are better in that regard. They have a more solid braking performance, shall we say. The stock brake discs can handle sintered pads on all models, so if you'd like to have a little bit more braking performance, and chances are someone who owned this bike before you might have gone with a carbon or an organic or some eco friction brake pads. So if the braking performance is lackluster, go ahead and try sintered brake pads. They perform really well, if the brake disc is still good, that is. Now the rear brake is just basic drum. It's 180 millimeters, or that's about 7 inches. That's in diameter. So it's just a basic drum brake. There's nothing special about them. The performance is not special, of course. The only exception is the drifter, the VN 800 CNE. Those have disc brakes. It is obvious which one has the more braking performance, but the drums aren't too bad if they are cleaned and adjusted properly, and if you use decent brake shoes. Now, as far as maintenance is concerned, the oil filter is very easy to reach. It is right in front of the engine, at the bottom, under the radiator. You can get to it with all sorts of removal tools, like the one with the steel band or one with that leather strap. It doesn't matter. You have plenty of clearance to work around it. The air filter is very easy to swap. All you need is just undo a single nut on the air cleaner cover and off it comes. The valve adjustment is done by swapping shims. So it's not a screw and lock nut type adjuster, but it is rather straightforward, and it requires no special tools or removal of anything apart from the cylinder head cover. Obviously, to get to that cylinder head cover, you have to take the tank and the seat off. But essentially, once the valve cover is off, you can have access to anything. The rocker arms can shift sideways in the head, so you don't need a special valve depressing tool like on Yamahas, like the XJ series, where you have to use a valve depressing tool to get the shim out of its socket. You can just slide the rocker arms sideways. That exposes the shims, and you can just pop the shims out with just a simple magnet, and that's all you need to change the shims. Speaking of valve jobs, that is very important on this engine. Every 10,000 kilometers or 6,000 miles, this has to be done. If you neglect it, it may drop a valve and smash a piston or bend a rod. So yeah, keep an eye on the valve clearances. The chain set is a basic 530 type, which is used on big sport bikes. So chains do last quite a while if they are oiled regularly. Nothing special about them, and they are also reasonably priced, so you don't need to shell out a lot of money on a specific brand specific or model specific chain set or chain kit. Now, the chain drive comes with an advantage. You can regear the bike to suit your needs. The early A models had a 16 tooth on the front and 46 tooth sprockets on the rear. That was a rear arm stretcher, but it screamed at high speed. Obviously, that changed quite quickly. As of 97, all bikes, A's and B models, so the classics and the Softail standard lookalikes, had 17 teeth up front and 42 teeth in the rear, which was a good middle ground, but still fairly buzzy, above 70 miles per hour or 120 or 110 kph. Now the drifters had 1740, so they had a bit taller gearing. The most popular setup, if someone travels on motorways or highways or freeways a lot, is either the 7040 if you have a lot of hills in your area, or 1840. And the 1840 makes it much more highway capable, and it calms the engine down. It only revs around 3,300 RPM, around 60 miles per hour. So it's almost like a 1200 Sportster in that regard, when it comes to revs, of course. Now, the spark plugs again, same thing, they don't need more than just the one per cylinder. You only need 2 plugs for this engine, and the plug is a fairly common type and cheap. It's an NGK CR7E. You need to remove the seat to get to the rear plug though. The front is easily removed by just using the spark plug wrench in the factory toolkit, which is a brilliant tool. So yeah, they are easy to swap. Unlike the 750, most bits that may go wrong eventually at some point are easy to get to, like the regulator rectifier or the generator stator. For example, on the 750, the engine had to come out of the frame in order to change just the generator stator, because you could not have access to the stator cover bolts while it was sitting in the frame. So some people developed a trick where they cut the stator plate out of the engine cover. But yeah, you don't need to do anything like that on the 800. It comes apart very easily. The clutch friction plate swap is also easy and straightforward. However, that requires draining the coolant. But to be honest, that is also a fairly simple affair. The fuse box is located under the seat, and you need to unplug the fuse box or junction box cables or sockets or whatever, the connectors, to move the cables out of the way, and that gives you enough clearance to pull the junction box out to swap fuses. It's not super convenient. It's not like popping off a cover under your seat or under your side cover without using any tools. Yes, you need to remove the seat and you need to fumble about with the cables and connectors, but it is still something that's still doable on the roadside should you need to. The seat is held by just a single bolt at the back, and it is very easy to pop off. Once that bolt is out, you can just grab the seat pan on the rider's side, lift a little bit and push it to the back, and the two claws under the passenger pad will just unhook and the seat comes off. Since it is a single carb engine, it means less maintenance, of course, and the carburetor is not too hard to get off. Rebuild kits, rubber diaphragms and all sorts are widely available. Avoid the cheap Chinese off-brand carb kits though, because, well, their quality is questionable. Same goes for the petcock. It is very easy to clean and rebuild. The rebuild kit is the same as the Suzuki Bandit 600. Usually if you buy the Bandit 600 kit, it is also cheaper than the Vulcan 800 kit, but the parts are identical. There are plenty of helpful videos on YouTube, e.g. Spelunkerd's channel. There's a link in the description to his channel. That is brilliant. He explains everything really well. Also, a lot of Harley-Davidson bits fit in the carburetor due to using almost the same carb as the Harley-Davidsons of the day. Now, the other thing that I wanted to talk about is the balancer shaft. The balancer shaft is gear driven and it has rubber bushings that can go hard and produce a knocking noise at takeoff and acceleration. You can find a video about that on my channel. It is not super difficult to replace those rubber bits, but you're going to need a flywheel puller, which is not a special tool essentially, because if you can go to one of these DIY stores where you can buy random sized bolts and such, it is all you need as a flywheel puller is an M18 by 1.5 millimeter. So that's M18, that's the thread size, and 1.5 millimeter thread pitch. It's a big bolt. You can just screw that into the flywheel, in the center of the flywheel, once the flywheel retaining bolt is removed, and you can use that as a flywheel remover. So yeah, it is a fairly simple bike to work on without using special tools. Otherwise, the engine is a very tough one. They last quite a long time. The piston skirts are Teflon coated and they are very wear resistant. The cylinder liners are also fairly cheap, around $120 or that sort of euros. And the cylinder liners can be swapped with just a shop press. You can just push them out of the cast cylinder assembly and replace them with a fresh cylinder liner and a couple new O-rings. So should you need to, it's not that bad. As a recommendation, I'd say stick to 10W40 synthetic oil and aluminium friendly organic acid coolant, OAT coolant, and replace them regularly. That is 6,000 kilometers or 4,000 miles for the oil, and at least every 2 years for the coolant. And avoid using RTV silicone when sealing crankcases or alike. You always use paper gaskets. The RTV may be squeezed into the case. Small bits can get into the oil, restrict or plug an oil passage, and that can lead to catastrophic engine failure. Now, there are possible mods. The first one is obviously a dyno jet kit or rejetting it. It is a fairly cold-blooded bike due to its long intake tract. Think about it, you have a carburetor fairly far away from the intake valve. So you have a Y-shaped piece of aluminium tubing leading from the carb to the intake valves. And that's a long path for the fuel to condense or fall out of suspension when the bike is cold and the engine is cold. So essentially the atomized fuel gets liquefied and it sticks to the walls of the intake manifold, and that makes them fairly cold-blooded in the winter time. Rejetting or using a dyno jet kit is a good idea. There's also a popular modification that is called scooterizing or Gremp-sizing. That is a heavy modification. It's doable at home, but it is a modification to the original airbox, cutting it open essentially and using a KNN filter to improve airflow quite a bit. Essentially, you triple the airflow. You need to reject the carburetor to suit the airbox modification, and you also need to at the very least debuffle the exhaust system completely, or get decent quality aftermarket pipes, and that can get you about 20% or 15% of horsepower gains at the best. Obviously it is a risky thing because although there are descriptions and testimonials and YouTube videos and forum posts and PDF documents that you can download and follow the instructions, you might end up with certain issues when it comes to tuning, because it doesn't seem to be a one-size-fits-all sort of solution. Some people have problems with this setup. Now, obviously, like I said, there are aftermarket exhausts made by Vance and Hines and all sorts of other companies like Delkevik and whatnot. That is a must if you want to up the power a little bit. The original stock exhaust is fairly restrictive and quiet. The other thing that is usually done to them is the removal of the secondary air system or the PAIR system. Now, that is the clean air injection system that delivers some air into the exhaust manifold right next to the exhaust valve, and that makes the exhaust run hotter, which wears the exhaust pipes out a bit faster. Usually after 20 years these don't work properly anyway, so this modification is not a bad idea to do. And there are YouTube videos regarding this. Check out links in the description of this video to get those links. Now, obviously, there are aftermarket bits for this bike, like windshield, saddlebag supports, and sissy bars. I don't want to mention any specific brand. You know what I'm talking about. If you go on eBay, you go on Motia or other sites where they sell sissy bars and luggage racks and whatnot, you will be able to find VN800 specific bits. So tarting it up a little bit or making it more practical is not a problem. Now, let's talk about the pros of this bike, the positives, the upside. it is a fairly light and it's relatively powerful in its class, especially compared to the bikes that came out at the same time as this, like the V-Star 650, Shadow 750, or the Suzuki's VL 800. Now, the V-Star and the Shadow, they are about 40 horsepower or like 42, 43, something like that. The VL 800 is about 50 horsepower. But most of these bikes are heavier than the Vulcan 800 and they produce less horsepower. So yeah, it is relatively powerful in its class. The chain drive means you can re-gear it to accelerate better or rev less on the highway. The single carb provides an easy maintenance. It is easily serviced without a lot of special tools. It has a very nice V-twin exhaust note due to the single crankpin design. It gives you a decent fuel mileage. If you do legal speeds, you can get away with 4.5 liters per 100 kilometers, which is 50 US mpg plus. That translates to 50 mpg US plus, of course. Obviously, if you're hard on the throttle, it is going to consume about 5.5 or 6 liters, but that's, you need to push it to consume a lot, which means in US gallons it goes down to the 38-40 mpg range if you're heavy on the throttle. The engine is very resilient. There are examples well over 100 and 150 or 200,000 kilometers. So we're talking about 120,000 miles without serious oil consumption, and that is, I think, a good indication. For example, the Suzuki Intruders or the VL 800s, which is very similar in age and design to this bike, they have a tendency to start sipping the oil around 50,000 or 80,000 miles, and yeah, those engines wear out a bit faster for some reason. That is not something that you will see on a Vulcan. Like I said before, with certain airbox and exhaust modifications, it's relatively easy to gain some extra horsepower, although that would need a little bit of expertise and a lot of research on your part. Obviously, if it has positives, it has negatives, it has cons. Now, I mentioned the chain drive as a positive. It is also a negative, it is also a con, because it is messy and it needs attention. Every 500 kilometers or 300 miles, you need to lube or clean the chain regularly, and that is a messy thing, and it's not something that most people enjoy. So I would say fit an oiler system. They are not difficult to fit, they are not expensive these days. Just have a look around on eBay. I do have a chain oiler on mine, which is a Cobra Nemo 2. You just twist the cap while you're riding every few hundred kilometers, and it will take care of the problem. The other downside of it is that it has no center stand. You need someone to keep it upright, or you have to put it on a bike lift or something along those lines. So yeah, it has no center stand, so you need to do something about that when you want to maintain it or want to check things on it. Now, it is also a carbureted engine, of course. That is a disadvantage for most people, because fuel injection is a lot more convenient. You just turn the key, you wait until the fuel pump stops buzzing, and you can go. Now, in this case, it is carbureted, of course, so it needs a bit more attention. If you want to store it for a while, you need to drain the carburetor. Every now and then the carburetor needs a good looking at for maintenance and whatnot. And like I said, it is fairly cold-blooded. So unless you take it to a shop or you rejet it yourself, yes, it is a cold-blooded bike, and it needs playing with the choke on cold days. Now, the last con I can come up with is that it's only 800 cc's. Because if it was a 1000 cc engine with this weight, it would be the perfect bike. It would be the perfect American style cruiser made in Japan. Now, the successor of the Vulcan 800 is the Vulcan 900, which is also made in two different configurations. One is more like a custom bike with a big skinny front wheel. That's the VN 900 Custom, and there's the VN 900 Classic with the fat 16-inch front wheel with shrouded forks and whatnot. Now those bikes have fuel injection. They have longer strokes, so that's how they achieved the bigger displacements. They are 900 cc. As far as the horsepower numbers are concerned, they push out a little bit less, about 50 horsepower, but they have a little bit more torque, about 20% more torque. So yeah, in that regard, they are better. They are also belt driven, and of course, like I said, fuel injected. Keep in mind they are also heavier than the Vulcan 800. The 900s usually weigh about 50 kilos more, which is about 110 pounds or something along those lines. So yeah, they are more modern, more updated, they have a bit more oomph to them, but again, there's a trade-off. They are also heavier. So in my opinion, in its class, the Vulcan 800 is worth its money, every penny of it. And I hope that that this little slideshow helped you out with a little bit of good and usable information. Thank you for listening. Don't like and don't subscribe. With certain issues when it comes to tuning, because